Got it, okay. I assume you did not hear my announcement. We're just waiting on our other witness. We believe that he is right outside the door, and as soon as he joins us, we'll start. Thank you so much for your patience. Listen, in an effort to be timely, we are going to go ahead and start out, give my opening remarks, and by that time, hopefully, we will be joined by the Honorable Stephen Rowe Lewis. If that's okay with everybody? Okay. The Subcommittee on Elections of the Committee on House Administration will come to order. I thank the members of the subcommittee, Representatives Butterfield and Aguilar, colleagues from the House, as well as our witnesses and those in the audience for being here today. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks, and that any written statements be made part of the record. Hearing no objections, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that members Grijalva, Stanton, and Lesko be invited to sit on the dais for the subcommittee hearing today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Good morning. My name is Marcia Fudge, and I am the chair of the Subcommittee on Elections. I want to begin by thanking Phoenix College of Maricopa County Community College for their hospitality and assistance in hosting this field hearing. I again thank my colleagues, our witnesses, tribal leaders, and the people of Arizona for joining us here today. I also thank my distinguished colleague, Congressman Gallego, for so warmly welcoming us to his district, and he will be joining us shortly, as well as my colleagues, Congressman Stanton, Grijalva, and Lesko, for welcoming us to Arizona as we continue this important work. We're here today to examine the state of voting rights and election administration in Arizona. Since the beginning of the 116th Congress, this subcommittee has been holding field hearings across the country, convening forums to hear from voting and election advocates, experts, community leaders, litigators, and voters about the state of voting rights and the election administration in their communities. The right to vote is sacred, and as members of Congress, we take our responsibility to protect access to the ballot very seriously. We have been listening closely and collecting testimony regarding the wide range of methods of voter suppression and discrimination being deployed across the nation. Today, we are here to learn firsthand from tribal leaders, voting rights advocates, and litigators about their experiences exercising the right to vote in the state of Arizona. Protecting the right to vote is fundamental to the health of our democracy. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was intended to protect the right to vote in every single corner of the United States. Each of us should be concerned by the erosion of such a fundamental law. Prior to 2013, Arizona was one of 9 states fully covered by the pre-clearance requirements of Sections 4B and 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Voting changes in Arizona had to be evaluated for their potential discriminatory impact and were subject to review by the Department of Justice. But since the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder, voters in Arizona have seen numerous changes to voting without evaluation of their potential to discriminate. Since 2012, Arizona has closed 320 polling stations in 13 of its 15 counties. Such closures pose access to voting challenges and may have a disparate impact on communities of color. The highest count of poll closures took place in Maricopa County, which is 31% Latino, with 117 closures. During the March 2016 presidential primary, there were reports that voters in Maricopa County waited in lines as long as 5 hours to cast a ballot. Arizona has a history of failing to protect the right to vote for Native Americans. Although Native Americans gained the right to vote in 1924, it was not until 1948 that Native Americans gained the franchise in Arizona. And still, for years, the Native American community continued to face discriminatory poll taxes, literacy tests, and other forms of disenfranchisement in Arizona. We must ensure all Native Americans and other language minorities have access to the translated materials and language assistance they need to cast their vote. In addition, the move towards vote by mail and the attempt to outlaw ballot collection raises concerns that Native Americans and others with limited ability to access a polling location or mail service will be disenfranchised. Further, although the Supreme Court held in 2012 that requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote is inconsistent with the National Voter Registration Act, Arizona still moved to require proof of citizenship when individuals register to vote in state and local elections, although the federal voter registration form does not. Native American voters and other minority communities are less likely to have the required ID. These are just a few examples of hurdles faced by Arizona's voters. It is critical to note that Chief Justice Roberts himself said, and I quote, "Voting discrimination still exists. No one doubts that," end quote. The Chief Justice argued Congress needs to present a more up-to-date record of the prevalence of voting discrimination in order to reinstate the critical protections of Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act. It is critical we examine the state of voting rights in America and build a true contemporaneous record of ongoing discrimination and barriers to voters, and that is why we are here today. It is clear there is much work to be done. I would now introduce our witnesses for our first panel. We have Jonathan Nez, who is the president of Navajo Nation, and Stephen Rowe Lewis, who is the governor of Gila River Indian Community. I thank you both gentlemen for being here. You will see a lighting system in front of you. When you begin, the light will be green. You will have 5 minutes. When you see the light turn yellow, that means you have 1 minute remaining. When you see the red light, that means please try to wrap up as quickly as possible. Thank you very much. Mr. Nez, the floor is yours. Okay. You have 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee, and also greetings to my friend here, Governor Lewis, from the Gila River Indian Community. With me in the audience is our Vice President of the Navajo Nation, Myron Leiser. And thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today on this very important topic. The Navajo Nation covers a large area of northern Arizona, and many of our people still speak our Navajo or Dene language. They live in rural areas of our homeland and travel many miles for basic services. These three areas are my focus today. While we can acknowledge there are many more issues we can talk about today or at future hearings. Number one, language. Like many older Navajos, I speak both Navajo and English. I grew up as Navajo being my first language. Many of our older citizens speak Navajo as their primary language and are more comfortable talking to others in the Navajo language. As I understand it, the Navajo language is covered under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. I also understand this requires that all election material provided in the English language must also be provided in Navajo. The Navajo Nation continues to have issues with some of the counties and the state of Arizona providing sufficient translation services to Navajo voters in written material on radio and to in-person voters. We are working this out with the counties in our region, but there is still a lot of ground to cover. A point I must make here so we all understand each other. The Navajo Nation has always worked with the counties in our area, and we will continue to do so for the benefit of all our citizens, including these issues of translation and understanding of election issues. I do not want anyone to misunderstand and get the idea that the Navajo Nation and counties are continually at odds with each other. We all work for the people of northern Arizona. Number two, rural living. The Navajo Nation covers 27,000 square miles in 3 states, just a bit smaller than Ohio, Madam Chair, your home state. Our capital is in Window Rock, Arizona, and we have 110 chapters or local government centers. When it comes time to vote on the Navajo Nation in Navajo state and federal elections, it is difficult for some of our membership due to the rural nature of our land. One example of rural living on the Navajo Nation is public transportation, which is available in most of the United States. There is no public transportation that allows for the pickup of individual citizens at their place of residence. This severely limits the transportation options for the elderly and disabled citizens. People are reliant on relatives or friends for rides, especially in the more rural areas. In some parts of the nation, only 1 in 10 families own a vehicle, which further limits transportation options. In addition, if there are tribal elections on the same day as the state and federal elections, an individual may be required to travel 2 separate locations in 2 separate communities to cast ballots on election day. This can lead to an individual spending many hours in one day driving and waiting in line to vote. I will cover this issue in a minute. A related issue to rural living is mailing address, and individuals' post office box location may be different, maybe in a different state or county than the individual's residence. A person may reside in Arizona, but their P.O. box and chapter house is in New Mexico. For example, Red Lake chapter, Arizona, and Crystal chapter, New Mexico. Or reside in Utah and their P.O. box in Arizona and issue for residents of Navajo Mountain chapter, Utah. Some individuals reside in Navajo County, but their P.O. box and local chapter house is in Coconino County. The example is Bird Springs chapter. For those here, these locations are not familiar, but are an issue for these living there because a discrepancy in the state or county location between an individual's post office box and their physical residence leads to difficulties for individual Navajos in registering to vote. If the county cannot confirm the location of an individual's residence, it will reject their registration application. Traveling issues, the third. In 2018, Apache County had only 2 early voting locations on the Navajo Nation in the southern part of the reservation. This resulted in community members from Tisna's Bunce chapter located near the Utah border having to drive a 95-mile one-way trip to vote early. This is like driving a 2-lane road from Columbus to Cincinnati. Less traffic, but just as long. This is in contrast to off-reservation populations with an early voting location in closer proximity to population centers and open for more days and longer hours. By limiting in-person early voting on the reservation, it hinders Navajo citizens from exercising their right to vote in their preferred manner. In conclusion, an issue related to traveling is that the county precincts do not align with Navajo political subdivisions, the chapters or local government centers, as I mentioned before. An individual's chapter house may be the polling location of a precinct, but because of where the individual lives in the chapter area, they are actually not in the same precinct that the chapter house is. For instance, the Cameron chapter directly north of Phoenix, about 200 miles, is not located in one precinct, but is divided between several precincts. A resident of Cameron chapter may be in the Botaway Gap precinct of Coconino County. If the individual works in Tuba City, the individual would have to take time off work to vote at his or her chapter house for a Navajo election and drive to another precinct polling location in Botaway Gap to vote in the state elections for a trip total of 60 miles. So in summary, there are many other issues we can talk about, but these 3 language, rural area, traveling conditions are what I focus on today. And I appreciate the time extended to us for our testimony, and I stand for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. One thing I did neglect to tell you, this is being live streamed, so at any point you may be on a camera, so just to forewarn you, so that you're not like doing something silly when the camera comes on. Mr. Governor, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Anya Anapchugak, Governor Stephen Rowe Lewis of the Gila River Indian Community. It's an honor to welcome you to our O'odham Juvid, our traditional lands of the O'odham peoples, and Chairperson Fudge, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you sincerely for the opportunity to testify on this important topic regarding voting rights and elections administration in Arizona. The Indian Citizenship Act made tribal members full United States citizens in 1924. But as we know, unfortunately, tribal members across Indian country are still fighting to secure and exercise their right to vote. Across the country, tribal members living on Indian reservations face unique voting challenges that individuals living elsewhere take for granted. And this is no different in Arizona. The Gila River Indian community strives to address and tear down the barriers faced by the community's tribal members and is actively involved in initiatives to increase voter turnout across our great reservation. The community is comprised of the Aguilar, O'odham, and the Peepash tribes and has over 23,000 enrolled members, with approximately 12,000 of those members residing on the reservation. Our reservation is roughly 372,000 acres and located in south central Arizona and both Maricopa and Pinal counties. The reservation is divided into 7 political districts, with 5 of those districts located in Pinal County and 2 located in Maricopa County. A little bit about our history. In 1928, the community's tribal members, Peter Porter and Rudolph Johnson, were denied the right to register to vote in Pinal County for 2 reasons. First, because the county did not believe that they resided within the state of Arizona since they lived on our reservation. Second, because the county believed that as American Indians, Porter and Johnson remained wards of the federal government, and that both they and the rest of American Indians in Arizona were not entitled to vote in Arizona elections for state and federal officers. Porter and Johnson litigated Pinal County's decision in the Arizona Supreme Court and lost. Unfortunately, the court agreed with the county that Porter and Johnson were, quote, under guardianship, unquote, of the federal government, and therefore not entitled to vote. Tribal members living on reservations in Arizona were unable to vote until 1948, when the Arizona Supreme Court overturned its previous decision and recognized tribal members' rights to vote in Arizona elections. In 1948, only 2 states continued to disenfranchise voters: New Mexico and Arizona. Tribal members' rights to vote in Arizona may now be fully recognized under the law, but tribal members continue to face barriers to voting. Within Indian country, tribal members are often turned away at the polls because of voter address issues, which combined with ineffective election administrators at unreliable precinct locations foster voter and tribal member distrust and disenfranchise in the voting process. There are important address issues as well. Under current Arizona law, all persons voting in person on election day must provide identification that includes an address in order to receive a regular ballot. If the identification does not include the individual's photo, then the individual is burdened with providing additional documentation. In contrast, individuals who cast provisional ballots or vote early by mail or in person do not have to provide identification in order to receive their ballots. Our community members generally prefer to vote in person on election day because voting by mail is difficult due to unreliable mail service on the reservation and issues related to their non-traditional addresses. The community's tribal identification cards do not include addresses. Also, individuals living on the Pinal County portion of the reservation do not have standard county street addresses, though through no fault of their own. Many tribal members do not even receive mail at their homes and pay for a United States post office box, which are only open during the week and for limited hours on Saturdays. In 2012, voter identification laws were strictly enforced on the Pinal County portion of the reservation, and many community voters were turned away from the polls when their addresses did not match the voter rolls. In very few instances, voters were offered and allowed to cast provisional ballots despite not having an address on their tribal identification document. The majority of these voters were denied ballots altogether. In Maricopa County, voters were turned away when the county ended up changing their voting precincts without effectively communicating these changes to voters. Despite improvements, many tribal members were again turned away at the polls in the 2016 election. Voter identification laws in Arizona and non-traditional tribal addresses problems remain still a huge barrier for our community's voters, and unless remedied, the community expects that these problems will continue in the next election. We've been trying to remedy this in certain ways. The community is working at a grassroots level to encourage and inform community members to participate in elections in partnership with Get Out the Vote. Our Communications and Public Affairs Office recently worked with GOTV and the National Congress of American Indians to produce video content to increase voter turnout among our community. These videos discuss the historic struggle to vote within Arizona and the need to increase the number of American Indian voters. This past August, we hosted the Arizona Native Right to Vote Day celebration. Voting registration has increased since the 2016 election, but the community remains committed to further increasing registration numbers by the community's estimates. Only 58% of the voting age population is currently registered to vote, and more must be done. Voting should not be hard to do. The community strives to carry on the legacy of Peter Porter, Rudolph Johnson, and so many other tribal advocates who fought to secure the rights that American Indians in Arizona have today, including our veterans. Ira Hayes, one of the flag raisers in Iwo Jima, comes proudly. He's a native son of the Gila River Indian community, and so we know that our native veterans who have served in the highest levels across the United States, they fought for and they sacrificed for our right to vote as well. So with that, thank you for this opportunity to tell the Gila River Indian community story on voting history and what we need to change in the future. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you both. We will now take questions from our panel. Mr. Butterfield, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Fudge, and thank you to the two witnesses for your testimony today. When Ms. Fudge became the chairperson of this subcommittee, she promised that we would take these hearings all across the country, and she has fulfilled that commitment, and we are here today in Arizona collecting evidence that will be used in a very constructive way when we return to Washington. So thank you, Chairwoman Fudge. Thank you to my colleagues who have joined this panel today, and thank the witnesses as well. This is a congressional hearing. As I say in all of these hearings across the country, this is not a political maneuver. This is a congressional hearing. We are collecting evidence as we travel the country that will be entered into the congressional record, and we will use it as members of Congress to try to reinstate Section 4 and to enhance and to improve voter participation across the country. And so this is a very important proceeding here today. I'm probably one of the few people around, no, there are a few more, who actually remember the enactment of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It was days after I finished high school, August 6, 1965. A very powerful law. The background of it is that after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that act did not include any provision regarding voting. That was too toxic of an issue to inject into the Civil Rights Bill, and so after that, Martin Luther King Jr. and others began a brand new movement in Selma, Alabama in January of 1965, determined to get a voting rights bill enacted into law. And so when the bill was finally enacted in August of '65, it included some very powerful positions. The most notable was Section 2, which gives every aggrieved plaintiff, a minority citizen, the right to bring a lawsuit if they feel that some election system is diluting or affecting their vote. But the other provision, which we are very concerned about, is Section 5. Section 5 covered many states throughout the country. Some states it only included portions of states. I believe here in Arizona it was not involved in the original 65 Act, but 7 years later, in 1972, the state of Arizona in its entirety was included in the Act for purposes of preclearance. The reason for that was not because someone wanted to punish Arizona, but that meant before 1972 there was a history, predating 1972, of severe voter discrimination, and so Arizona was included. And so for years and years, Arizona was required to submit voting changes to the Department of Justice for preclearance. But all of that came to a screeching stop on June 25, 2013, when the Shelby decision was rendered by the Supreme Court. But what many people do not fully understand is that the Shelby decision did not invalidate or strike down Section 5. It simply called on Congress, called on us in Congress to enact a formula that is a modern-day formula that will enable Section 5 to be more objectively applied. And so we are collecting evidence, and we're going to present that evidence in the public record, and hopefully we can persuade the Supreme Court to accept a revision of Section 4. And so thank you for your testimony. It's very valuable. I was really struck when I read the briefing material today that since 2012, in the state of Arizona, 13 of 15 counties have closed polling places. 320 polling places have closed. If Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act were still in full force and effect, that would not have happened. Each one of those closures would have had to have been pre-cleared by the Department of Justice. DOJ would have looked at it, and the burden of proof would have been on the state to prove that those closures were would not have a discriminatory effect, not purpose particularly, but a discriminatory effect. And so I just want to put that on your mind this morning and just thank you for helping us with this fight. And we're going to keep fighting until we can get Section 5 restored. So thank you very much for your testimonies today.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And just like my colleague, I want to thank the Chairwoman for bringing this important hearing to Arizona. President Nez and Governor Lewis, in your testimony, you both highlight challenges and barriers that are unique to our friends in Indian country. Both of you spoke about the role of institutional barriers related specifically to access as it relates to P.O. Box and the role that residency plays spanning states or local jurisdictions and the role that local election officials play. Inhibiting voting information and the potential for a right to vote by mail. Can you both expand a little bit more on this and the role, the specific challenges that your communities face related to the P.O. Box and the jurisdictional issues related to receiving ballot information and how that affects individuals' opportunities to vote? President Ness.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Aguilar, and thank you for the question. You know, the barriers that we see on the Navajo Nation is many. But one of the things that we do on our nation is when there is a day of elections, it's a day to bring everybody together, to catch up with family members, to catch up on politics, and it's really a social event. And, you know, when it comes to mailing in ballot provision, some of our citizens opt not to get mail-in ballots to their homes or to their boxes. But as was mentioned in the written testimony, that there may be at times as many as 5 families sharing a P.O. box. There's not enough post office boxes in a community that can take care of many of those citizens. So at times, you know, there may be some confusion by the postmaster and ballots get lost or they're not given to the family member. And so one of the things that we're advocating for at the federal level is a little bit more resources so that we can have larger P.O. boxes, post offices on the Navajo Nation. The other is also about the limited resources on getting information to our Navajo citizens. We're very rural, and that's why we're advocating on more broadband capability in rural Arizona, let's put it that way. And that includes tribes, where we can get instant information through the internet, and so that any type of election changes we could get, as well as getting up-to-date changes in the election law. Like, for instance, I'll give you one example here in the state of Arizona, members of the committee. Senate Bill 1154, ARS 16-201, recently passed through the state legislature, changed the elections to the first Tuesday in August. And so on the Navajo Nation, we had elections, Navajo elections, and county, state, and federal elections on the same day. Now with the change of the date, you know, if we're talking about, I think Madam Chair and Representative Butterfield mentioned the voter participation. Navajo elections, when we vote for Navajo candidates for our own government, voter participation is about 40+% turnout. And so the reason why we put it the same time as county, state, and elections, federal elections, is to get that voter participation up high. And it did work. It did work. And now with the changes, we believe that the voter participation will decline for county, state, and federal elections. And that news is new to a lot of our constituents out on the Navajo Nation. So how do we get that information out? Is always through P.O. Box or some other type of social media, but not everybody has internet access. So those are some concerns that we have, and thank you for the question, Representative Aguilar.
Governor Lewis, briefly.
Thank you. In 2012, a number of our community members were turned away because of the strict enforcement of the 2012 voter identification laws. So the community tried to work with, and this was in Pinal County, and the community tried to work with Pinal County in a proactive fashion leading up to the 2016 election. We tried to remedy the voter address issue so that no community voters would be turned away. So the county revised their poll worker training material concerning voter identification to address reservation voters and include tribal identifications as an acceptable form of identification. The county also agreed to test an early voting site for one day during the 2016 general election period on the reservation, provided an opportunity for early voting without showing identification. And that actually increased some of the votes in Pinal County from our community members. But still, despite those improvements, the community had Pinal County tribal members located in Pinal County who were still turned away at the polls and did not vote in the 2016 election. So voter identification laws in Arizona and non-traditional tribal address problems still remain a huge barrier for the community voters.
Thank you. Ms. Lesko, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, both of you, for being here. This is a really good opportunity to hear the unique problems that you have on your nations, and so thank you. I do have a question for either one of you. With these unique problems that you have you worked directly with the Secretary of State, Katie Hobbs, to try to address these issues? And has anything been done? Either one of you, Mr. President Nez.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Lesko and committee members. We are working with the Secretary of State as well as the county recorders that are within the Navajo Nation. Mm-hmm. And, you know, at times we do have to fight very hard, and even to the point where we have to take it into the courts. And right now we have settled the case with the Secretary of State as well as a couple of the counties in the state of Arizona in terms of their focusing and bringing more Navajo speakers to the polling sites. And not just the during Election Day, but also the early voting. There are early voting sites that get proposed by the counties, and even the mobile early voting sites. And so, you know, those are being addressed. We're working hard, just as I mentioned in my testimony. I think we have a good working relationship, but at times we do have to let them know and remind them of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 and Section 5, and let them know that we are concerned that our Navajo speakers on the Navajo Nation are not being given the opportunity to get their explanation on voting and voting participation. So, thank you.
And the other thing that was brought up previously was that we have less polling locations throughout the state. And I know that one of the answers given for that is because we've increased vote by mail so much in the state. So I'm trying to get an idea, if you know, either one of you, how many of your members vote by mail? What percentage has it grown? Because that really is one of the main reasons, at least statewide, that we've decreased the number of polling locations, is because statewide, 75% of the voters now vote by mail. And so do either one of you know how many people in your nations vote by mail?
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, I don't have specific numbers, but I know that it is a significantly smaller percentage that vote by mail. And just to really, draw an important connection that President Nez, my fellow tribal leader, said, Election Day is important to us. It is about family. It is about reconnecting. We have, on our reservation, we sponsor traditional meals at the polling sites, aside for our community member voters to come out to proudly come out and vote as their right as U.S. citizens, but also members of sovereign nations as well. It's a tradition. It's an ingrained tradition among our community, especially with our elders as well, our veterans. Sometimes our elders bring their young grandchildren to model for them that voting is important as well. So there we have a proud history of the voting day being significant across our community as well. In regards to proactive solutions with Secretary of State Hobbs, the community has worked with the Intertribal Council of Arizona, a consortium of tribes here in Arizona, where we actually were happy to have hosted just maybe about 4 months ago a gathering that Secretary Hobbs came with her staff, Intertribal Council, county recorders, and tribal representatives to work together on this. So in one room for all day, we had those county recorder reps from across Arizona, and we brought them together with those tribal reps, so that if there were any issues, that they were all of the same mind, that we had ongoing training for the latest voting laws, that there would be a coordinated, not a tribe versus a county, but also to increase that there were contact points between tribes and those county recorders that, as you know, is critical, to make voting day be as successful as possible.
Well, I'm glad you're working together, and I know my time's out, but there's also an agency that's under the jurisdiction of House Administration called the Election Assistance Commission, and so they're supposed to help with resources, so possibly they could be a help as well. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Mr. Grijalva, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for your leadership on this subcommittee and bringing this attention here to Arizona and to our Native people in the state. It's important that all communities in this very important discussion about voter access, franchisement, and participation be included, and I very much appreciate that, and thank you for that. The couple of ironies, Arizona was one of 9 states prior to the Shelby decision that was required for preclearance on many issues. Even in the upholding of the harvesting issue that the Ninth Circuit said, if preclearance would have existed, this legislation and this effort would not have occurred. Having said that, I think historically, there's a reason why Arizona was included in those 9 states. And those vestiges are not all completely gone, and we all know that. And hopefully, this will lead to a dispassionate, factual discussion about what needs to be done to make sure that every eligible voter in this country and in this state has a chance to vote. Governor, Mr. President, I want to talk about 2 things. Voter ID, and you mentioned that, and maybe amplify a little bit on that. And then also, I think, the issue of access to polling areas. And the other one is the one about, given the distances, given accessibility, Given the issues with mail access addresses, the HR 2023 prohibited the gathering of ballots in communities, and particularly, and put stiff fines on that as overreach on a non-existing issue of voter fraud. But I'm asking the question because in response to what that legislation means to particularly areas that you serve and eligible voters on your tribal lands in remote areas, and how that affects and does not affect, if you wouldn't mind. Mr. President?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Chairman Grijalva, and again, members of the committee. Let me just give you a perspective, an overview of what Navajo is looking at, and I think a lot of other tribes throughout the country. And I agree with you, Madam Chair, when you say that the right to vote is sacred. You know, Navajo Nation and many tribes across the country would like to see Congress pass a Native American Voting Rights Act. And it would address the many concerns that have been raised today and are being raised today. Voting issues are based on policies passed at the county and or the state level. And it varies from county to county, as you heard today. And that causes confusion in Indian country. The Native American Voting Rights Act would provide much needed consistency in the administration of voting in Indian country. It would honor the government-to-government relationship with the federal government. And I do agree as well, too. And if that's going to take some time, then we do have to advocate to keep the Voting Rights Act intact, Section 2 and Section 5. We are coming before a census count right now, right? That's no secret. Navajo Nation is doing their very best to count every Navajo citizen there. But I just want to keep you in mind and keep you informed that a lot of our family members have to leave the Navajo Nation for other opportunities, whether it's jobs or university or colleges, and sometimes they get counted elsewhere. And so we're encouraging our Navajo citizens that are visitors outside the nation to make sure they get counted, because, you know, when it comes to redistricting, we have an accurate count so that we can have our representation in the counties, in the state, as well as in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, and of course, I think history is crucial to this as well. In 2004, Arizona voters approved, as you know, the Arizona Taxpayer and Citizenship Protection Act, also known as Arizona Proposition 200, which required voters to present evidence of United States citizenship prior to voting. In 2013, elements of Proposition 200 were overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in Arizona versus Intertribal Council of Arizona Incorporated, in which the Supreme Court struck down the parts of Proposition 200 that required proof of citizenship from individuals who use federal voter registration forms to vote, but allowed the state to continue to require voters to show identification at polling places. So there are still, even though portions of that were struck down by our high court, there are still barriers. There are still critical issues that need to be changed, to be remedied. And on behalf of the Gila River Indian community, I think it is time, overdue time, to get federal legislation to protect the rights to vote on Indian reservations among its First Americans, because we do have a unique relationship. We do have unique situations on Indian reservations, from traditional addresses to the barriers that are inherent on Indian reservations, Madam Chair.
Thank you so very much. Mr. Stanton, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank Phoenix College for hosting this important hearing, to you, Chairwoman, and former Mayor Fudge. Good. Thank you for doing this hearing. During my time in Congress, I've come to know you as one of the most passionate and effective voices for the right of every American to have equal access to the ballot box, and I want to thank you for having this important hearing here in Arizona. And to my friend to my left, the Dean of our delegation, the Chair of Natural Resources Committee, Congressman Grijalva, thanks for all you do to protect federal lands, particularly our Native American lands here in Arizona and around the United States of America.
Okay, thank you.
And he's not here, so I'll say things in absentia about him. I want to take a quick moment to recognize Congressman Gallego as well. He's one of the leading sponsors of H.R. 1694, the Native American Voting Rights Act, which I believe after this hearing, everyone will agree we need to pass in Congress and send to the President's desk. I'm proud to be one of the original co-sponsors of the bill. In fact, we have 5 House members from Arizona who are co-sponsors of the bill. I'm hopeful that our 2 U.S. senators will take a look at the companion bill in the Senate and add their names as co-sponsors as well. And I want to thank our 2 outstanding witnesses, Governor Lewis, President Nez, 2 of the finest, most effective leaders I know. I've had the pleasure of working with Governor Lewis for many years, especially on the issues of water and water planning for the state of Arizona. He's a visionary leader. Forward-thinking leadership has meant a lot for Arizona. President Nez was sworn in January, just like myself, and I've had the chance to spend time with him when I visited the Navajo Nation for a few days just last month. Let me tell everyone here, you can already see the positive difference he's making, and there's so much hope for the future. We're fortunate to have both of you here. It's no secret that elections in Arizona, historically and still today, are a mess. The nation took notice in March of 2016 when thousands of voters in Maricopa County waited hours, 5 and 6 hours, to vote in the presidential preference election. I remember going out to the long lines myself, handing out water and cookies to those who were willing to wait unacceptable length of time to do their civic and patriotic duty. It's still fresh in my mind how our election officials were caught like deer in the headlights. They drastically cut the number of polling sites, and they thought nobody would notice. Well, we did notice. We saw firsthand how those cuts disproportionately hurt lower income and underrepresented communities. It's an important reminder of why, for decades, a bipartisan majority of Congress and presidents of both parties renewed the Voting Rights Act and why Arizona was a pre-clearance state. I was the mayor of Phoenix at that time. The day after that election, I asked the Department of Justice to investigate what took place. My letter to the GOJ provided additional details I don't have time to cover today, so Madam Chair, I'd like to enter that letter into the record, if I may.
No objection, so ordered.
Thank you so much. I have a couple questions. President Nez, a few weeks ago, I had a conversation with the Navajo Nation's elections director. He expressed a great deal of frustration about the level of assistance that you're getting to conduct fair and open elections. What kind of support do you need from the state and county officials for the Navajo Nation community to have better access to the polls?
Thank you for the question. Madam Chair, Representative Stanton, committee members. I did briefly mention our lawsuit against the state as well as the counties in providing better assistance to our Navajo-speaking citizens. That's the first step. We'd had a dialogue. As a matter of fact, we had a meeting with Navajo County and Navajo County officials and with the recorder. And I think more of those types of meetings will help in clarifying some of the barriers between the county and the Navajo Nation. But in terms of actual assistance, I think having the state legislature members come out to Navajo Nation to hold these types of hearings, just as you are doing today, which is very crucial to know the ins and outs of Indian country. And we look forward to, being a host to some of our representatives so that they know, because a lot of the laws that are being changed for the state of Arizona go through the legislature, and sometimes they don't know that it hurts the nation. And I gave you a good example of that. It's
Yep.
changing the primary election date. And now we worry that voter participation may decrease because the election is not the same time as the Navajo Nation elections. And so, that percentage could decrease and affect our representation in the county, state, and federal government.
I think it's a great point. I'll just finish up with this by making the point that so many of our elected officials who may come from urban areas just don't quite understand the challenges your communities face when it comes to access to mail. So I think that point deserves a lot more exploration. I think we're going to do so throughout this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Gallego has joined us, and so we'd like to hear from the representative of this district. Mr. Gallego, you're recognized.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you, first of all, to my leaders here, Mr. Butterfield and Ms. Fudge, for organizing this. And they've been great leaders in the voter enfranchisement world and have been for quite a while. I'm very honored to have them here in my district. I apologize for being late. I had to take my son to the dentist, and apparently 2.5-year-olds do not like dentists. So that was a struggle. But I really do appreciate both of you gentlemen for being here, also for always being leaders within the Native American community. And, I think I remember my days at the Arizona State House, and I certainly remember when there was approaches and attempts to stop ballot collection. And one of the things I kept hearing is the potential for voter fraud. Now, in my experience, there never has been any proven at all accusation of voter fraud when it comes to collection of mail-in ballots. Do you know, either of you gentlemen, if you have any history or know of any history of collection or fraud when it comes to mail-in ballot collection that occurred on your prospective reservations? We'll start with my right, Governor Lewis.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I have never heard of any sort.
Okay.
Thank you.
President Nez.
Not to my knowledge as well, Representative Gallego.
And since this quote-unquote ballot harvesting law has taken place, have you heard the opposite? Have you heard of people not being able to actually get their ballots in because of this law that discourages, active participations of people trying to actually, have people vote, especially in, as we know, in both the Gila River as well as the Navajo Nation, the long distances that you have to travel with not great roads. Have you heard of people basically being disenfranchised because of this law?
Madam Chair, Representative Gallego, I've definitely seen the barriers increase to our voters on the Gila River Indian community voting at the polls, access to voting, access to early voting, being at sometimes feeling that they are being singled out and discriminated for being Native Americans living on an Indian reservation.
And Chairman Nez.
I was just going to say thank you, Representative Gallego. The language barriers, I mentioned that earlier to the committee members, the Navajo language. A lot of the information, all the information that we receive from the recorders or even the Secretary of State, they're not translated into or written in the Navajo language. And so if someone that's a English speaker gets a ballot and they don't read what's on the envelope, which states that you have to sign the envelope before you turn it in. And I think there are instances where some of our members didn't sign that, and they were told that it wasn't a legitimate ballot. And the other is turning in the ballots. When an individual turns in the ballot, it has to be that individual turning in that ballot. Sometimes, I talked earlier about transportation and families helping each other out. Sometimes people don't necessarily have to go all the way to their county headquarters or the county seat, which, from Kayenta to Holbrook is 3 hours, and I don't see grandma taking that 3-hour trip. They might give it to one of their relatives, drop it off, but then when they do that, it's invalid.
And just to have a follow-up question, if I remember the law as written, the first time they try to run it, and then the second time is that only an immediate family member can take a ballot in, if I remember correctly. Now, in both Navajo and Gila River tradition, the idea of family is a lot more expansive than an Anglo family, correct? Could you kind of explain how, this more Anglo-centric point of view of family basically disenfranchises your communities? We'll start with President Nez.
Yeah, and thank you again for the question, Representative Gallego, and committee members. For the Navajo Nation, I'm sure for other tribes, we have a clan system where, we have 4 clans, and we relate to each other's in that type of kinship there on the Navajo Nation. So it might not be an immediate family or an extended family, but somebody could be my brother on the other side of the Navajo Nation. And so that's something that folks out off the Navajo Nation have a hard time grasping.
Governor Lewis.
Yeah, thank you. And extended family is important, is a bedrock of our community as well. If you were raised by your aunt or your uncle, they're, for instance, they're, for all intents and purposes, in our custom and tradition, they're your father or your mother as well. Grandparents, and also, for me, my late grandfather, his 2 sisters were one of our first poll workers as well. And they made sure, that we voted. And they made sure that, that would be my first cousins or my second cousins, they're all family. And so I think that's important, we look at our families as expansive. We don't look at family in a constrictive, non-Anglo sense. Excuse me.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. And as we wrap up this session, let me thank you both. And if our next panel would prepare themselves to come up, let me just make a few closing remarks. Let me first just apologize to you for the injustices you have endured in this nation. I think about history, and I realize that my ancestors were brought here against their will. Many people came of their own free will, but you were here. And I think that it is important for us to understand that as we talk about the greatness of America, America is great because of her ability to repair her faults. It is time for us to do what is right by your nation. It is time for us to make you feel as if you are the kind of citizens that you always have been because you were here first. And I think that it's also important that as we measure ourselves against the rest of the world and other nations want to measure up to us, that we have to set the right example. And we should not in any way ever try to make it more difficult for people to vote. We should be encouraging people to vote. Yes. It is unconscionable to me that somebody would have to drive an hour or 2 or 3 to cast a ballot. It is un-American. It is un-American. And with that, I would thank you again, and we will prepare for our next panel. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. You do know what that is, right? Valentine's Day. You got time, you want to run out? We'll give you, go ahead. Can you take the picture real quick? Hey, Mr. Hodge, how are you, sir? Oh, I see Mom, too. Hey, how y'all doing? Good. Sisters out there? We'll begin in just 2 minutes. We've got a couple of panelists that had to step out very quickly. We will begin shortly. Just as I speak, they enter the room. Let me introduce our second panel. First, we have Patti Ferguson Bonnie, all right, the director of the Indian Legal Clinic, faculty director of the Indian Legal Program, and clinical professor of law at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. Lorena C. Van Asch, okay, is a lawyer and the current chair of the Arizona State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. I'm gonna give it a shot. Montserrat Arredondo?
Yeah.
Is the table director at One Arizona, a coalition of 19 organizations focusing on voter registration and civic engagement. She began her career in advocacy in 2010 when the infamous Show Me Your Papers bill, SB 1070, passed in Arizona. Mr. Alex Gulotta is the Arizona State Director of All Voting is Local, where he fights for the right to vote through a unique combination of community power building, data-driven advocacy, and strategic communications. Prior to that, he served the Access to Justice community for more than 30 years as an anti-poverty advocate. Darrell Hill. Darrell. I am just striking out today, but Darrell Hill is the ACLU of Arizona's policy director. And lastly but not least, Arizona State Senator Michelle Ugenti Rita.
You got it.
Ha! Representing the 23rd District. The senator is an Arizona native and was first elected to the Arizona State Senate in 2018. Previously served in the Arizona House from 2010. I welcome you all, and we will begin with Ms. Boney, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Fudge and members of the committee. Yes, ma'am. Good morning, Chairwoman Fudge and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this important issue of voting rights and elections administration. My name is Patti Ferguson Bonnie. I am the director of the Indian Legal Clinic at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. The clinic runs the Native Vote Election Protection Project in Arizona, a nonpartisan effort to protect Native American voting rights. As you heard, there is a long history of voter suppression in Arizona. Things have improved with the Voting Rights Act. However, Native Americans continue to face obstacles. In order to understand Native American voting challenges, one must recognize the vast differences in experiences, opportunities, and realities facing on-reservation voters. Isolating conditions such as language, socioeconomic disparities, lack of access to transportation, lack of residential addresses, lack of access to mail, the digital divide, and distance are just some of the factors that impede access to the polls and participation in the political process. Unfortunately, decision makers often fail to consider these factors when adopting new laws or practices that impact the right to vote. A recent study found that low levels of trust in government, lack of information on how and where to register, long distances to register and to vote, low levels of internet access, hostility towards Native Americans, and intimidation are obstacles to Native American voter participation in Arizona. Native Americans do not have equal access to voter registration. Many voters must travel long distances off reservation to register to vote, in some cases 95 miles one way. Further, in 2016, only 1 of 9 covered jurisdictions subject to Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act for Native American languages translated voter registration information in the covered language. And while online voter registration is possible for off-reservation voters, this option is limited for on-reservation voters. First, less than half of the homes on tribal lands have reliable broadband access. Second, even if a voter has internet access, the state does not allow tribal IDs to be used to register to vote online. Third, individuals with non-traditional addresses cannot use the online process to register to vote. In addition to voter registration barriers, Native Americans also have unequal access to in-person early voting opportunities. While every county has in-person early voting off reservation, there are limited opportunities for in-person early voting on reservation. If offered at all, most in-person early voting is limited to a few hours on 1 or 2 days. In 2016, 10 reservations had some form of in-person early voting, and only 5 had in-person early voting in 2018. One of the most egregious examples of lack of access to in-person early voting involves the Kaibab Paiute tribe. Kaibab Paiute residents must travel over 280 miles one way to participate in early voting. These voters do not have a polling location on or near the reservation on election day. In fact, Mojave County moved the tribe's polling location to Colorado City, and when the tribe requested a polling location on the reservation for election day voting, it denied it, citing ADA compliance issues. Vote by mail is not the solution for tribal communities. Lack of access to home mail delivery, public transportation, vehicles, and language assistance, as well as long distance to post offices, make it difficult for Native voters to vote by mail. In addition, voter ID continues to be a problem for Native voters. Even when a voter has a valid form of tribal ID, these are rejected in each election due to insufficient poll worker training or because of problems with non-standard addresses. Until recently, voters could vote early without showing an ID. However, in 2019, the state enacted a law requiring voters to also show ID if they vote early in person, while voters who vote early by mail have no such requirement. Not only does this violate equal protection, it will disproportionately impact Native voters, specifically Native language speakers who can only receive language assistance in person. Prior to Shelby County, covered jurisdictions would have to consider whether a law would have a negative impact on minority voters. This is no longer the case. Legislation affecting voting often appears neutral, with the stated goal of preventing voter fraud. The application of said legislation, however, has a disparate impact on minority voters. Without Section 5's protection, there is a new concern that voting laws and practices will continue to be adopted that suppress the Native American vote. These concerns include closure of polling locations, adopting all vote-by-mail elections, and voter ID laws. Using pretexts such as ADA and voter integrity to undermine voting rights should not be allowed. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee. I look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you, Ms. Bonney. Ms. Ash, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairperson Fudge, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to testify today. I am the chair of the Arizona State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And in March of 2018, the Arizona Committee convened a public meeting in Phoenix where we heard testimony from government and election officials, advocacy organizations, election and voting experts, and voter perspective groups on barriers to voting in the following areas: access to polling locations, bifurcated voter registration system, voter ID law, and restriction on mail-in ballots. Additionally, on the impact of the Shelby B. County decision. After reviewing the oral and the written testimony, the Arizona Committee prepared an advisory memorandum that was submitted to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and my testimony today will attempt to summarize the findings that are found in the advisory committee. And I'll start with the first section on access to polling locations. As Chairperson Fudge identified in her opening remarks, in the aftermath of Shelby B. County, Maricopa County made national headlines for the long wait times. Nearly every county reduced the number of polling locations. In Maricopa County, officials cut polling locations by 85% compared to the 2008 presidential preference election and 70% compared to the 2012 presidential preference election. Election officials who testified justified these closures due to a decrease in demand because of an increase in early voting preference, cost pressures, and less locations willing to serve as polling locations because of increased liability, lack of security, lack of compliance with ADA, and insurance concern. Some of these election officials testified that the remedy To remedy the closure of polling locations, counties have the discretion to implement a vote center model. Members of the disability community testified that they were especially impacted. They said that when they showed up, the poll workers lacked knowledge on how to operate accessible voting machines and even failed to turn on the machines. They testified that these polling locations lacked wheelchair ramps or elevators and sufficient accessible parking spaces. We also heard testimony that transportation was a barrier for protected voter groups to access the polls, impacted the disabled community who often rely on public rides and due to the wait times could simply not wait long enough to vote and get back on their public rides, as well as the Native Americans who reside in reservations, as you've heard, some spanning thousands of square miles and have few or no polling locations available to them. We also heard testimony on language access. The committee heard testimony that poll workers are not adequately trained to deal with non-native English speakers. This barrier to voting is especially problematic for Native American voters who often are non-native speakers. The third area is voter ID and bifurcated voter registration system. As the committee is aware, Arizona has a dual registration system that allows individuals to register to vote with the federal form for federal elections only, but requires voters in the state and local elections to meet additional voter-approved proof of citizenship requirements. Testimony revealed that Arizona's bifurcated voter registration system is confusing and may have prevented voters from participating in state and local elections due to the proof of citizenship requirement. The state's paper voter registration form is different from the online voter registration form available through servicearizona.com. The state's paper voter registration form provides a space for applicants to add a tribal ID number that is especially beneficial to our Native American citizens, but that is unavailable on the online registration system. Therefore, Native Americans who choose to register to vote online face additional challenges when completing their online form. The last area that we heard testimony on was the restriction on mail-in ballots, or what is commonly known as the Ballot Harvesting Law. In March of 2016, Arizona passed HB 2023, which makes it a felony for individuals to knowingly collect and turn in another voter's completed ballot. Even with the voter's permission, there are some exceptions that exist for family members, household members, caregivers of the voter, as identified within the statute. The HB 2020 is part of ongoing litigation. In last October 2018, a 3-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit upheld HB 2023. However, in January of this year, the Ninth Circuit granted a full panel review of the smaller panel ruling. And so that, again, is part of ongoing litigation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Ms. Arredondo, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairperson Fudge, for having me here today, and everyone on the panel. Again, my name is Montserrat Arredondo, and I'm with One Arizona. We're a coalition of 20 501c3 organizations that work to expand voter registration across the state, and we are looking to close a gap between white voters and people of color voters in the state. We were founded in 2010 and have been doing voter registration and civic engagement work for the last 10 years, starting with the Latino community because of the SB 1070 law, and have expanded to other groups like our Native American co-panelist here today. And then I'm gonna go right into it. Empathy towards voting rights for Latinos and First Peoples have run deep amongst Arizona leaders for decades. As unauthorized immigrants to Arizona spiked in mid-2000s, cynical conservative politicians like Joe Arpaio and Russell Pierce once again discovered they could stock racial animosity for political gain. One of the first policy outgrowths of the movement was a 2004 white supremacy omnibus ballot initiative titled, in classic Orwell fashion, the Arizona Taxpayer and Citizenship Protection Act. This measure included a voter ID law, a first of its kind documentary proof of citizenship requirement for voter registration, and new registration on access to public services for certain non-citizens. While Arizona has, in some but not all respects, moved beyond the overheated anti-immigrant atmosphere of that era. The conservative movement against democracy has only intensified in recent years. Since Governor Ducey came into office in 2015, we have seen a law making it a felony to collect another voter's ballot, even with that voter's permission, and turn it in to be counted. An expansion of the Arizona Supreme Court allowed Ducey to appoint a career legislator for anti-government organizations, the most aggressive local preemptual law in the country, designed to progressive policy at the local level. A comprehensive deregulation of the state's campaign finance law, a tax on voting rights to use ballot measures designed, in the word of the state GOP chair, for the ballot initiatives to be thrown out for minor errors regarding language and paperwork. A tax on Arizona's clean election system, a beacon of light in all the darkness, reoccur every legislative cycle. Additionally, we have failed to take action as a state to administratively ease participation, like expanding technology that will allow for real-time availability of data and communication between state agencies, like postal services, DMVs, et cetera, for rapid updates and verification of registrations. This would also reduce the number of provisional ballots and reduce the number of rejected early ballots. The following are some of the solutions outlined from a report produced by One Arizona, Arizona Advocacy Foundation, and the Intertribal Council of Arizona. Extend current voter registration deadlines. Many states have same-day voter registration and cite only minor increases in printing costs. Increase types of identification at all polling locations, including student IDs, tribal ID, and local issue identification, possibly a library card. Reduce rejections of early ballot by allowing ballot postmarked on or before election day to be counted. The report continues to outline an action plan to protect and expand voting rights for all eligible Arizonans, and that's something that's been turned in to the committee here as well. And we will continue to work in all of our organizations to protect the right to vote for all Arizonans. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gulotta, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairperson Fudge and members, I am Alex Gulotta, the Arizona State Director for All Voting as Local, a collaborative housed at the Leadership Conference Education Fund. We fight to protect the right to vote. Thanks for having me today. Voting in Arizona is changing. Since 2013, when 5 justices of the Supreme Court ended preclearance in Shelby County, these changes in election administration have been made without notice, without transparency, or without analysis of their racial impact. Here are 3 examples, you've heard some about them, of how Arizona voters have been harmed. First, vote by mail. We've talked about ballot collection. In 2011, the Arizona legislature passed SB 1421 that outlawed collection of mail-in ballots by community groups. Historically, these drives were conducted by Latinos, African Americans, and Native American communities. The bill was specifically targeted to end these drives, and the U.S. Department of Justice refused to pre-clear the bill in 2011. However, in 2016, after Shelby County, almost an identical bill was passed, HB 2023, the constitutionality of which is on review currently in the Ninth Circuit. However, Chief Judge Sidney Thomas said in his dissent in the panel opinion that's currently on review, quote, HB 2023, which criminalizes most ballot collection, serves no purpose aside from making voting more difficult and keeping more African American, Hispanic, and Native American voters from the polls than white voters, close quotes. 2 polling place changes. Nationwide, between 2012 and 2018, there were 1,688 poll closures in Section 5 jurisdictions. 230 of those were in Arizona. Maricopa went from 671 to 500. Cochise shrunk from 49 to 17, Cochise County. Polling place changes cause confusions about where to vote, and in Arizona, that means votes get rejected. In 2016, Maricopa voters were switched back and forth between vote centers and assigned polling locations, and that made it 40% more likely that a voter would cast an out-of-precinct ballot. And out-of-precinct ballots don't count in Arizona at all. Quoting Ninth Circuit Judge Thomas again, quote, "This practice places a discriminatory burden on African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans," close quotes. In addition, post-Shelby, we've made drastic changes to polling place administration without publishing any data on the racial impact of such changes. We've implemented vote centers and new technologies that may in fact offer benefits to voters, but we have made these changes without doing any analysis of the potential racial impact, and that's what really needs to happen. Third, new ID requirements. Arizona recently expanded the scope of its photo ID, and you've heard a little bit about this, making it harder to cast an in-person ballot, an early in-person ballot. For years, if you voted early in person, you filled out your ballot, you put it in the envelope, and you signed the outside of the ballot, and that was your ID to vote. But in the spring of 2019, the Arizona legislature passed SB 1070, requiring a photo ID for in-person ballot in addition to the voter's signature. Arizona was not required to seek permission for this because pre-clearance is gone. Yet this restriction on early voting creates significant obstacles for Native Americans. In Arizona, just 26% of Native Americans live on a USPS postal route. To answer Congresswoman Lesko's question, on the Pebble, our permanent early voting list, 80% of the people on the Pebble are white, 1% are Native American. Access to early in-person voting matters to Native Americans. But to understand this detriment of this new ID, we just need to look to Navajo County. Travel times are huge, and officials provide early in-person voting in community locations, such as at the grocery store and at the Friday flea market. Voters always have their signature with them, but do they have their tribal ID? Now, without it, they will be deprived of their right to vote in their communities. In summary, I would like to say that the fair and equitable access to the ballot box is a cornerstone of our democracy. We must ensure that every voter can fully participate and that the fundamental right to vote is protected at every level, and that means a restored and modernized Voting Rights Act. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hill, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairperson Fudge and members of the committee. My name is Darrell Hill. I'm the Policy Director for the ACLU of Arizona. With over 65,000 members, activists, and supporters statewide, the ACLU of Arizona works across party, racial, gender, and economic lines to advance the mission of defending the principles of liberty and equality embodied in our Constitution. I'm going to skip ahead past HB 2023 since we've heard a lot about that. During the 2019 Arizona legislative session, Arizona saw renewed attacks on the right to vote, including efforts to purge early voting rolls, criminalize paid signature collection, and to prohibit voters from returning ballots they received in the mail in person. None of these provisions sought to expand access to the ballot or increase voter participation. Rather, they represent attempts to make participating in our democracy more difficult. Two new laws passed by the Arizona legislature and signed by Governor Ducey, SB 1072 and SB 1090, placed new voter ID requirements to early and emergency voting. Voter ID requirements disproportionately impact minority voters, senior citizens, voters with disabilities, and others who do not have photo ID nor the money to obtain ID. Approximately 11% of all voting eligible adults have no government-issued photo identification. Voter ID laws are often discriminatory and have a discriminatory impact. 25% of Black Americans of voting age lack a driver's license or state-issued ID, compared to just 8% of white Americans. Voter impersonation fraud, the only type of fraud that ID requirements would prevent, is virtually non-existent in Arizona and across America. Voter ID laws restrict access to the voting booth while doing nothing to protect against real threats to our voting systems. Since Shelby, Arizona has also seen an increase of poll closures, which has led to increased barriers to voting. For the PP election in 2016, officials opened only 60 locations, down from 403 in 2008, a nearly 85% decline. The results were chaos. Low-income and minority communities bore the brunt of the impact. In primary Anglo communities like Cave Creek, there was one polling place per 8,500 residents. In Phoenix, a majority minority city where 40.8% of its 1.5 million residents are Hispanic, there's one polling location for every 108,000 residents. The reduction in polling places across Metro Phoenix created long lines at polling centers across the metropolitan area, forcing some voters to wait up to 5 hours after the polls closed to cast a ballot. Arizona voting rights problems are compounded by our incarceration crisis. Not only does the United States continue to lead the world in the rates of incarcerated citizens, it's one of the world's strictest countries in terms of denying citizens the right to vote due to convictions for a crime. Over 6 million Americans are currently disenfranchised due to a felony conviction. Arizona has the 8th highest rate of felony disenfranchisement in the United States. Over 220,000 possible voters, or 4.25% of Arizona's voting age population, are ineligible to vote due to a felony conviction. Arizona's rate of felony disenfranchisement has nearly tripled over the last 25 years. Over 150,000 of those eligible voters in Arizona have completed the full length of their sentence, probation, or parole. Arizona utilizes a complicated judicial application process where persons convicted of 2 or more felonies must apply to have their voting rights restored at the completion of all terms of their sentence. The decision of whether to restore a person's right to vote is left completely to judicial discretion, with no guidance for when a person's rights should be restored. The process leads to flawed, biased outcomes that conditions a person's constitutional right to vote on the ability to persuade judges who have different individualized criteria for restoring voting rights. The restoration of voting rights should be automatic at release from incarceration. States should pass legislation providing that rights of individuals who are citizens of the United States to vote in any election should not be denied or abridged because of that individual's conviction of a criminal offense. In addition, states should no longer use costly restitution, fines, or fees as barriers to the restoration of voting rights. These practices criminalize poverty and exacerbate the racially disparate impact of felon disenfranchisement. States should eliminate repayment of legal financial obligations as a condition for rights restoration. Voting is a fundamental right and cornerstone of our democracy. We should strive to make our democracy a beacon to the world. To do so, we must eliminate practices that discourage voter participation and have the effect of limiting registration rates for communities of color, low-income Arizonans, and other communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Wonderful, thank you. Good morning, Chairperson Fudge and subcommittee members on elections. Thank you for the invitation to address you this morning. During my 9 years as a state legislator, I have been actively engaged in improving Arizona election laws. I evaluate bills based on 4 criteria. First, does it enhance and protect the integrity of elections? Second, does it empower voters? Third, does it enable voter participation? And finally, does it improve the maintenance and consistency of the administration of elections? To be clear, I do not believe election policy should be a partisan issue, and I have a strong history of fighting for these principles that often cut across partisan lines. For example, in 2012, I championed legislation that required all candidates to run in the fall of the even year, when turnout is strong, an obvious win-win for everyone. After the presidential preference election debacle in 2016, brought up several times this morning, when there was mass voter confusion and unacceptable wait times to vote, I convened a special meeting of my elections committee to question then Secretary of State and then Maricopa County Recorder, both fellow Republicans, to understand what happened and who was responsible. And in 2017, I held the Republican-controlled Maricopa County Board of Supervisors accountable after learning that they were operating under an outdated intergovernmental agreement from 1955, allowing the board to abdicate many of their important statutory obligations regarding the administration of elections. These are just some of the many examples that demonstrate I have a strong and unwavering, nonpartisan advocate of fair and impartial electoral process. Arizona is and has been on the forefront of efforts to increase voter turnout and participation, all the while protecting the process from fraud. Sadly, as the saying goes, no good deed goes unpunished, resulting in some of those efforts to increase voter participation, specifically the enactment of mail-in voting, to be abused by ballot harvesting. My bill successfully banning the practice of ballot harvesting, which allows third parties to collect or harvest mail-in ballots of individual voters, is a major step forward in maintaining the ability of Arizonans to participate in the electoral process via the mail without fear of it being manipulated. Many political operatives and activists criticize this common sense prohibition, claiming it unduly burdens voters by making it more difficult to return their mail-in ballot. This claim is simply not supported by the facts. Arizona's mail-in system is a voluntary one, whereby voters voluntarily elect to receive their ballot via mail, fill it out, and return it within the generous 27-day early voting period. And it is counterintuitive to think that a voter would sign up to participate in a process presumably for its benefits, and in this case for the convenience of having their ballot mailed to them, then criticize that very process as burdensome when mailing it back in the prepaid envelope that accompanied their ballot. Again, it is difficult to believe someone who uses the mail to pay bills and send and receive other correspondences would only struggle when it came to mailing back their ballot and not struggle with their other mail. Mailing a ballot back is not the only option available in Arizona. Arizona allows for many other methods to return a mail-in ballot. However, opponents of my anti-ballot harvesting bill continue to argue that the bill burdens voters, despite the fact that in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision upholding the law, they note, and this is important, they note that not a single voter testified at trial that HB 2023 made it significantly more difficult to vote. In fact, the bill was in place for the 2016 elections when voter turnout was a roaring 74%. Voting by mail is only one of the many options available in Arizona. It is easy and convenient to vote in the state of Arizona. If you are not voting, it is because you have chose not to. Arizona should be commended for adhering to its constitutional responsibility of enacting laws to secure the purity of elections and guard against abuses. That's in our Constitution, often in the face of unsubstantiated and frankly offensive claims of voter suppression and racial motivations. The proponents of ballot harvesting have failed. They have failed to provide any meaningful evidence, statistical data, or direct testimony during the legislative process as well as the bench trial that breaking the chain of command and entrusting a third party to collect a voter's mail-in ballot is in the public's best interest. We are unfortunately forced to conclude that only outside forces and special interest groups have a vested interest in protecting the practice known as ballot harvesting. We as legislators cannot allow for the potential of lost ballots, undue influence, and fraud to taint our electoral system. Voting is the most direct method to impact government, and the process should be protected to ensure voters have confidence in the system and its outcomes. And I ask you, what is the outcome of an election worth if nobody believes in it? The risks are high, and our democracy is only as strong as our fair and open elections. The solutions, painfully simple. Secure our elections, protect the process from cheating, and enforce our current laws. My bill banning the practice of ballot harvesting gets us one step closer to that ultimate goal. Thank you, committee members.
Thank you. Please. Mr. Butterfield, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to the 6 witnesses for your testimony today. It's very valuable. Let me address my questions to the gentlelady from the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. Bonnie, how do you pronounce your last name?
Bonnie.
Bonnie,
Yes,
Bonnie.
sir.
All right. I got it, like Bonnie Watson Coleman. All right, one of our colleagues. We've talked extensively about the absence of Section 5 and what impact it is having on the right to vote. Let me focus my remarks and my questions on Section 2. Before I went to Congress, I was a judge in my state for 15 years, but before that, I was a voting rights attorney back in the 1980s, and so I know the subject matter quite well. I'm not a legal scholar on it, but I know it quite well. Section 2 is a very powerful instrument. It's a very expensive instrument, but it's very powerful. Have there been any Section 2 cases filed in Arizona in recent memory?
Yes, thank you for the question. I've actually been involved in several Section 2 cases in the state of Arizona. One after the 2000 redistricting on behalf of the Navajo Nation. Also the voter ID litigation that was brought on behalf of the Navajo Nation and other Native American citizens in the state of Arizona. And currently we have litigation ongoing in federal district court dealing with the lack of access to early voting, voter registration, and noncompliance with Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. So there is litigation, but Section 2 isn't a viable replacement to Section 5. It's very expensive and time-consuming.
Section 5, the burden of proof is on the jurisdiction.
Right,
To prove
right.
the absence of discriminatory impact.
Right.
And in Section 2, the burden is on the plaintiff.
That's right.
Yes.
And as you've heard, as you probably know, tribes have limited resources, and they shouldn't be shouldered with the burden to bring cases to ensure that the right to vote is protected. And I just want to give you an example with regards to the last round of redistricting in the state of Arizona. We have an Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission. It was the first time that the commission consulted an expert to determine whether or not the maps retrogressed. And it was the first time that the state of Arizona received pre-clearance on the first try. And for tribes in the state of Arizona, we have one majority-minority district, and there's a concern that without Section 5, that the impact of redistricting on Native American voters will not be considered and potentially lose that majority-minority Native American district.
Can you give me a ballpark figure about how much the average Section 2 case, fully litigated, would cost in the state of Arizona?
Fully litigated.
Just on the average. I know there are extremes, but on average.
Without revealing any confidences
Sure.
or anything like
well
that.
Well over $100,000, much more.
Up to $1 million.
Yes, absolutely.
Because you have to have experts who testify on your behalf and
Absolutely.
have, many resources to
Has the
bring
Department
these
of
cases.
Justice initiated any Section 2 cases in Arizona?
The Department of Justice, for the 2 decades that I have been working in voting litigation in the state of Arizona, has not initiated any cases on behalf of tribes.
Let me use my last minute and a half with you, Mr. Hill. Thank you for your testimony today. I want to talk about restoration of voting rights. Are there any Arizonans who are convicted felons who have completed their sentences, completed their obligations to the court, who have not been allowed to register to vote?
Absolutely, absolutely, Representative Butterfield.
These are American citizens living in Arizona who have completed their obligation to the court system, who are not allowed to vote.
Absolutely. A couple years ago, the ACLU of Arizona did a records request to the Maricopa County Superior Court seeking information about people who had attempted to restore their right to vote. What we found was that I believe 25% of those persons have been denied their restoration due to owing fines, fees, or some other financial obligation. Of those people who were denied the right to vote, another 25% owe no financial obligation. So they had fully completed their sentence, they had paid all their financial obligations, but the court has still denied their right to vote. And at the time, there was no explanation for why.
And they're over 18 years of age, they are American citizens.
Yes.
And not allowed to vote.
Yes.
In both state and federal elections, or just state elections?
Both state and federal elections.
Is there any ongoing litigation currently to address that?
Not in Arizona, not that I'm aware of.
Anyone aware of any litigation presently to address the issue of restoration of voting rights? Well, thank you so very much for your testimony, Madam Chair. I will yield back.
I will recognize myself, Mr. Butterfield.
May I seek a point of personal privilege, Madam Chair? I'm trying to inquire about the ladies in the audience wearing red. Is there any significance about that with your sorority?
My sorority sisters, Delta Sigma Theta in the audience.
Thank you. I yield back.
You can always count on the chair to bring some friends. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to ask two questions, and if our panelists, because of the limited time, I do apologize, if you could give me a yes or no answer. This is based on the prior panel and also on the testimony that you gave us today. My first question, Ms. Bonnie, I'm going to put you on the spot first, and we'll try this. We'll see how this goes. Does the closure of polling locations have a disparate impact on minority populations in Arizona?
Yes.
Ms. Van Ash?
My testimony is relying on our findings in our advisory memorandum, and we didn't reach a yes or no answer on that. So based on that, I will abstain from answering.
Okay, appreciate it. Ms. Arredondo?
I would say yes.
Ms. Gulotta?
I would say yes.
Mr. Hill?
I would say yes.
Senator?
Well, I think it's important to note that those who choose the polling locations are the County Board of Supervisors, so it's the most relevant question for them. And so what they choose as polling locations is based on their information and their due diligence.
You don't
it's a
have
question
any,
for them.
You don't have any opinion on whether that disproportionately affects minority populations?
I think the polling locations suffice, but if more polling locations are needed, then you need to go to the more appropriate governmental jurisdiction, which is the County Board of Supervisors and the Maricopa County Recorder. Both of those entities are in charge with choosing polling locations and vote centers.
Understood. Ms. Bonnie, do residency challenges and lack of language assistance have a negative impact on Native Americans participating in state, local, and federal elections?
Yes, may I add something to
Yeah.
that? So in the state of Arizona, I think Governor Lewis and President Nez said this, but I just want to reiterate that most Native Americans do not receive mail at their homes. That in addition to not having access to transportation or receiving mail at their homes, that the roads are in poor condition, primarily in Indian country. And so without that access, it becomes a challenge to participate in any vote by mail. And I also want to note that in the state of Arizona and different counties, that people have been defaulted to the PEVL, so the permanent early voter list. So if they did not choose that, sometimes they were defaulted by the county, and they cannot be expected to participate in early voting and then go to the polls and have to complete a provisional ballot. And that's actually contrary to Arizona law, but that's the reality is on the ground.
I appreciate it. Ms. Van Ash, I'll say it again. Do residency challenges and lack of language assistance have a negative impact on Native Americans participating in state, local, and federal elections?
Yes.
Ms. Arredondo?
I would say yes, and I just want to bring back testimony from President Nez that only 1 in 10 Native tribe members own a vehicle, and there's no public transportation on the Navajo reservation, along with some folks having to travel anywhere from 60 to 90 miles to get to their polling location. So I just want to bring that back. That is a far way to go to vote on Election Day.
Thank you. Mr. Gulotta?
I would say yes also, just because there are many, many people who actually need the ballot translated to be able to access our franchise. My Lyft driver this morning, her mother, she was telling me the story about how her mother had to have her ballot translated to be able to vote. And that's what allows people to access the franchise. And without those kinds of protections, we really can't have our Native American community members really participating the way we want them to.
Thank you. Mr. Hill?
I would say yes. When you look at the combination of poverty in many of the Native American communities, lack of internet access to access online voting, online registration opportunities, coupled with the lack of transportation and language access issues, presents a real barrier for Native American communities to vote in Arizona.
Senator?
Thank you, sir. No.
Thank you. I'll do this to Mr. Gulotta and Ms. Van Ash, based on your research, as well as the groups that you represent. Some people are going to say that the polling closures are a reaction to declining in-person voting. Why would that be right or wrong?
It may in fact be true. The problem is since pre-clearance, we no longer study the impact of closing polling locations. And so we don't know who gets harmed. We do know from from Judge Thomas's dissent in the DNC versus Reagan case, we do know that it significantly statistically increases the use of out-of-precinct ballots, which means people's voting rights are denied. Because people are confused, they go to the wrong place, they're given a ballot that then doesn't get counted, and that's really a travesty, and we've got to figure out a way to correct that problem. And so maybe it's more education, maybe it's more outreach, but maybe it's more polling places, and without pre-clearance, we don't really know because we don't study these things anymore.
Thank you. Ms. Van Ash, quickly.
And I missed that question, if you can repeat it.
Some people are going to say that the polling closures are a reaction to declining in-person voting. Based on your research, would that be right or wrong?
I think the testimony that we got from the, at least Maricopa County election officials, was that the reason for the reduction was the decrease in demand and the increase in early voting preference, but that was one side of the issue. I don't think we received testimony on the other side, so I don't know that that's, again, it's an elected official, and so although their testimony is valuable, perhaps it's one-sided, and I don't think that the testimony really supported that beyond that person's testimony.
The answer could be that we need more data. Thank you so much. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Lesko, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Madam Chair, I hope you'll remind the audience not to boo or heckle any witnesses. Thank you.
This is an official congressional hearing. We would ask that you would be respectful of all of our witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, thank you all of the witnesses for coming here today, and I especially enjoyed the first panel because I need to hear firsthand the unique problems that our Native American members have. I think what I've heard so far is that we need more polling locations. We can't use a tribal ID number online. I don't know if that's still the case. That was in 2018, correct? Okay. We need to train poll workers better. It basically brought up about disabled folks and other folks, and that somehow we're automatically putting people on the PEVL list, the county recorder. And so I just want to say most of these problems should be solved at the state or county level. And they should be. And that's why I encourage everyone to reach out to their county and state election officials. Also, the long lines in 2016 were brought up many times, and as many of you know, but maybe not my colleagues from out of the state, that was, the voters spoke up loud and clear, and they ousted that election director and installed a new one. Also on the federal issue of more post offices, that was brought up too on native lands. That is a federal issue, and that I would like to work on. I do have questions for Miss Senator Ugenti Rita. You had brought up about your bill, HB 2023, which bans ballot harvesting. Why do you think that was necessitated?
Yes, thank you for the question. Well, election issues generally and ballot integrity and specifically have been my primary focus as a legislator, and I take very serious the responsibility to ensure the electoral process has integrity, voters trust it, and want to participate in it. Therefore, when I heard from constituents about the issue, I started to do my own due diligence on it and quickly realized something had to be done. Frankly, I believe ballot harvesting flies in the face of fair and impartial elections. And as the chair of House Elections Committee at the time, I decided to do something about it and introduce my bill to ban the practice.
And thank you. Senator Ugenti Rita, do you think that this same bill would benefit other states? Because there's a concern that was noted in some media reports in California. There's a belief that about 7 Republican seats were flipped because of ballot harvesting.
Yes, thank you. And let's not forget North Carolina, but absolutely, every state that cares about their elections should follow Arizona's lead.
And thank you. And I do want to bring up kind of maybe I got it wrong, but most of the president and the governor of the Indian nations said that most of their members like to vote in person, and that it's part of tradition and that type of thing. So I do think we need to look at more polling locations, in the Indian Nation or Native American Nation, but then that wouldn't be affected by your ballot harvesting bill because that just deals with early voters, correct?
Correct. My ballot harvesting bill ban only deals with voting early by mail. So it only deals with those ballots that are sent to a voter in the mail. So if you chose to vote early, in person, or chose to vote in person day of, you would not be affected by the ballot harvesting ban.
And thank you. And there seemed to be some question about what family members could carry a ballot. And so I have the bill in front of me, and it says a family member means a person who is related to the voter by blood, marriage, adoption, or legal guardianship. So some of the examples given that, like your grandmother couldn't take it or your uncle, is that inaccurate?
Yes, and also in the litigation, the plaintiffs did not challenge the definitions of those exceptions, so that would lead me to the assumption that they didn't find those exceptions to be problematic.
Thank you. And since this law has been in effect for 2 cycles, election cycles now, has there been any complaints filed that you know of?
Excellent. Not only has there not been a complaint that I'm aware of, I'm not even aware of others receiving complaints in the community. And of course, the district court judge noted that no complaint was made at trial. No one testified that they were precluded from voting because of the ban.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gallego, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. It's good to see you here, Representative, or Senator, is it now? Representative.
Yes, Senator.
I've known you for a long time, worked with you a long time, and I know you're very passionate about these issues. What bills are you thinking about introducing next year when it comes to voting issues, voting ballots, ballot harvesting, or permanent early voter lists?
Thank you for the question. It is good to see you. I have known you for a long time now. I am looking at taking on the topic of the voting manual to make sure that that goes through a proper vetting process. That does come with the enforcement of law, so we do need to make sure that's what's included in that manual are things that the county and other local officials can follow.
We're in limited time. What about, are you going to introduce the bill that makes the permanent early voter list not permanent, like you did last time?
Well, it's called permanent early voting list, so by definition, it's supposed to be only permanent if you vote early.
So you
But
did
if you want me
introduce-
to introduce it, I totally will.
So just to clarify for the panel, everyone here, last year you introduced a bill that said that if you did not vote in how many past elections, you're going to get kicked off the permanent early voter list. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. What were the other restrictions that actually came along with that legislation?
I don't recall. Is there one that you want to bring up, and I'll answer it?
I believe there was something about that they would be restricted to also not be allowed to drop off their ballot.
Okay, yeah, that's a different bill. I thought you were talking about the first one.
Can you describe
Yes.
that bill where you're not going to be allowed to drop off your ballot at the polling place?
Yeah, absolutely, I'm happy to. So a part of what some of the problems Arizona has been experiencing is very long time frames to get election results. Timeliness is important. It's an important part of the electoral process. And so we need to make sure that the results of elections are indeed timely.
So
And
couldn't you actually
what happens
subsidize the county so they could
what
actually just count
happens-
ballots sooner
what
instead of
happens
trying to
is-
restrict people turning in ballots?
Sir, do you want to listen to the answer?
Yes.
I'll give it to you.
Go ahead.
Okay. So what happens is because a lot of these ballots are dropped off day of, and statutorily, you are not allowed to verify the signature or open them until after 7 p.m. on Election Day, they contribute to the delay in the results. If you were to mail back your ballot, which I think is what the system is designed to do, it does come with a pre-stamped envelope, that would go a long way in reducing
Great, I'm going to reserve my
those
time back. Mr. Gulotta, is there a better solution than trying to disenfranchise thousands of Americans, Arizonans, than this?
Yes, I mean, we already have a process for actually removing people from the voting rolls under the.
Let's
Yes.
skip to like the actual dropping off of ballots. Is there a better process in doing this than stopping people from dropping off ballots?
Yeah, we can just start counting them sooner.
Crazy.
And we have the right to start counting them sooner. We just we preclude people from counting them sooner.
Yielding back my time,
And-
Representative, back to your bill on ballot collection. Did you have tribal consultation while you were creating that law?
Yes, excellent question. The bill was the process of a legislative stakeholder process, which means that it was assigned and heard in the appropriate committee and passed out. It was then debated in committee of the whole, the entire chamber, and then received the majority of votes needed to pass out of each chamber and then signed by the governor into law.
Okay, no, and I understand that. I was a state rep with you. But did you speak to any tribal nations, organizations, before you passed that law to try to take their input while you're crafting that legislation?
Right. Well, in committee, it's open to the public and any other vested stakeholder who wants to come in and register their either opposition
Okay,
or
so you
their support of
understand
the
why
bill.
you
And
understand why some of us are concerned that there wasn't tribal consultation. Will you have tribal consultation going forward? Will you actively work with tribal organizations before you create these types of legislation in the future?
I did by introducing the law and having it go through the appropriate process.
But you did not do a reach out program to them or anything
Yeah,
of that nature?
I had the bill in committee.
Okay. Representative, Senator Ugenti, how many tribes
Okay.
are there? How many federally recognized tribes are there in Arizona?
I don't know that number, sir.
There's 21. You've been a state rep and a state senator elected, I think, since 2010, and you're crafting legislation that affects Native Americans, but you don't know how many federally recognized tribes are in Arizona. This is why you should probably actually
Madam
invite them
Chair,
over.
can you
Do you
tell
know-
the audience not to interrupt, please?
Please, audience, no participation. So this is why I suggest if you're going to write up more legislation, you should probably have active participation and actually invite tribes, since you yourself do not even know how many tribes are in Arizona. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Stanton, you are recognized for 5
Thank you
minutes.
very much. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I also have a few questions for the Senator. Thank you for coming earlier here today, and you did have the opportunity to hear our two outstanding tribal leaders testify on their concerns about the impact on tribal voting participation as a result of HB 2023, the ballot collection bill. In your testimony, both written and verbal here today, you said that you were, quote, forced to conclude that only outside forces and special interest groups could oppose HB 2023. Do you consider Arizona's tribal communities, quote, outside forces or, quote, special interest groups?
No.
Were you aware of tribal opposition to your bill before today?
Yes, sir.
Then why would you characterize tribal communities as special interest groups or, quote, outside forces in your testimony?
Look, I'm going to quote what the Ninth Circuit District Court of Appeals said when they evaluated this bill in their decision. The panel held that the district court did not err in holding that HB 2023 violated the First and 14th Amendments because provisions impose only a minimal burden on voters and were adequately designed to serve Arizona's important regulatory interest. The court defined, in their opinion, referred to those burdens as de minimis, meaning too trivial or minor to even merit consideration. I support the bill because there's not enough evidence to suggest that banning this practice hurts anyone.
Do you, after hearing the testimony today of the tribal leadership and the impact on their members as a result of the bill you championed in the legislature, do you consider that to be, quote, de minimis on the impact on their tribal members?
Yes, I agree with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision upholding the district court. I also remember hearing in the prior panelists tell me that many of the Native American communities prefer to vote in person. And I think it was brought up earlier by Congressman Debbie Lesko, and I'll reiterate that my bill only deals with mail-in voters.
Did you or any members of your staff invite tribal participation at the hearing before the Elections Committee that you chaired on HB 2023? That's a yes or no question.
It's open to the public.
Senator, your written testimony states that, quote, it is difficult to believe that someone who uses the mail to pay their bills and send or receive other correspondence would only struggle when it came to mailing back their ballot and not struggle with other mail, unquote. Before today, were you aware of the unique issues members of our rural tribal communities face when it comes to mail?
Yes, thank you for the question. And so, and I think I brought this point up early in my statement. Why would you elect to receive something by mail that then became a problem for you? So if you're going to sign up for something that presumably is going to offer you a convenience, then it would make sense that that convenience would last longer than just receiving the ballot, but it would also be there for you to return it. Again, this is an elective system in Arizona. Other states are different, but in Arizona, if you want to participate in mail-in voting, you have to make the effort to sign up for it. Nobody forces you.
Thank you. After hearing from Governor Lewis and President Nez, do you agree that perhaps HB 2023 is having a unique negative impact on our tribal communities and that it would be worth revisiting these issues in the next Arizona legislative session?
No, I don't. And I'd also like to note that there are very reasonable exceptions in the law. So it's a very small amount of people that we're talking about perhaps would be affected. Remember, these exceptions are caregiver, household member, and family member. That, coupled with the fact that I heard that most individuals in the tribal community prefer to vote in person, or at least perhaps in person early, I don't think this will have a large effect.
Thank you so much.
Again, the courts described it as de minimis.
I think it's unfortunate and sad that our tribal leadership was not reached out to before this bill was passed in our state legislature. When I think of the last few minutes, they demonstrate that when important decisions are made at the state capitol that have a direct impact on our Native American population, too often these citizens are forgotten. They aren't at the table. And when they voice their concerns, they are dismissed as, quote, outside forces or, quote, special interest groups. It's puzzling and frustrating to me that at a hearing on an important voting rights issue that could go on for more than 2 hours, as the hearing in the Arizona legislature did, nobody thought to ask for the opinions of our tribal leaders. Nobody wanted to push this bill, who wanted to push this bill seemed to care. And my friends, that is exactly why the Voting Rights Act was so important and why the Supreme Court's decision was so harmful to so many Americans, because the rights of our minority are too often shut out by the interests of the majority. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of the Native American Voting Rights Act, and this hearing has shown today why we need it, and it has strengthened my resolve to fight for it. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Grijalva, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Bonnie, trying to put a nexus, a federal nexus, an important role for Congress, the Voting Rights Act, obviously, but the trust responsibility that's inherent in the Constitution with Native nations and indigenous people in general. The relationship for the discussion we're having here today and that trust responsibility, as you see it.
Yes, well, I mean, obviously have been issues with tribes in voting, and the U.S. has a trust responsibility, and I think as Mr. Butterfield asked, have there been Section 2 enforcement actions taken on behalf of tribes in the state of Arizona? No, there haven't. Have counties failed to comply with Section 203? No, they haven't. But have there been enforcement actions taken on behalf of Native peoples? No, there haven't. In Arizona, 5% of the population is Native Americans. They comprise over 27% of the land base. Only 18% of the land in the state of Arizona is privately held. So there's going to be a disproportionate impact when people who live in cities and urban areas are making decisions and not considering the impacts on our rural communities who often don't have access to mail, but also we have communities who don't have access to utilities or even running water. And those are the realities on the reservation. And so the federal government should step in, ensure that Native Americans have polling locations and access to early voting and voter registration.
If nothing else, under the mandate of the trust responsibility.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gulotta, did I get it right?
Yes, sir.
We've heard a lot today about the purity, to some extent, the integrity of the voting process. You know, the administration, this administration, tried on the same issue of voting and integrity. Had, I think, Kovacs or somebody run a committee for a while that went nowhere, and then quietly and thank God disappeared into the night. But the point I'm making is that there is a national strategy on the issue of suppression, whether you want to hear it or not, and that it targets. And it targets poor people, people of color, and in the instance that we're discussing here today, indigenous people and tribal lands. I want to ask you about that national, and then we're talking here in Arizona, where it seems to be that the underlying agenda in that targeting is keep the power in certain hands and keep the political policies in a certain direction. And so let's talk about strategy, not necessarily the legal one, but the political ramifications of not enforcing and doing the right thing with the Voting Rights Act in terms of extending protections and preclearance and trust responsibility that was added to the agenda. Sir?
Thank you, Congressman. I think the real issue here is just the cumulative effect of all of these attacks on people's voting rights. HB 2023 attacks the right to do ballot collection. SB 1072, so we say mail, but you don't need mail. So then we look at SB 1072, but now you need an ID for early in-person voting. We make it harder to vote in person early because now we need an ID on top of our signature. We've made that harder. We have a bill that tries to criminalize voter registration. That didn't pass the last session. We had a bill that didn't pass last session that was designed to prevent people from dropping their ballots off at the polling place. There was a bill that was going to purge people from our permanent early voting list, and it goes on and on and on. And they are part of a concerted strategy to, in fact, disenfranchise people from voting. And if you read the dissent in DNC versus Reagan, I think you will get a good understanding of exactly what is happening and why, and that it really is targeted at hurting people of color, and we should fight back against that. And the biggest weapon for people of color against this kind of voter suppression is preclearance, because preclearance shifts the burden of proof from the voter to the government. And when if the government, whether it's the Secretary of State or whether it's the local registrar, when they decide to take action, they have to prove that they're not hurting people. And that makes a huge, huge difference, and that's why we need to get back to preclearance.
Madam Chair, yield back, and thank you again for conducting this hearing and having it here in Arizona.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you all, but I'm going to ask you, so give you a minute to think about it. If there's one thing that you want us to do when we get back, or one action you want us to take, or one thing that you think that we should focus on from your testimony today, tell us what that one thing is. And I'm going to give you a minute because I want to ask a couple of questions. One is, well, first let me just make a statement. I think that there's some confusion about what the federal government is responsible for as it relates to elections. Every person sitting up here is elected based upon what the federal government does, as is the President of the United States, as is the U.S. Senate of the United States. As well, we have the responsibility to ensure election security and integrity in any election. We also, especially as you talk about now, and you hear on the news all the time about interference from other nations, we have those responsibilities for cybersecurity, for integrity, and for security. As well, the federal government has to ensure that protected classes are not treated unfairly. And that's why you have heard questions about how it affects the poor, how it affects people of color, et cetera. So we do have an overall responsibility for elections. So don't think it's solely a state issue. It is not. So I just want to make that clear as we go forward so that the audience is not confused about our responsibility. Secondly, I think to the senator, I understand clearly what you've been saying to me. I'm just curious, how many people came to you about the harvesting, that it was so important an issue that you needed to take it to make a law?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Generally speaking, probably maybe a dozen.
So, and what is the size of the state of Arizona?
It's the population,
Yes.
6.5 million, but there's no correlation between the two, if that's what
Well,
you're trying to do.
That's your decision. My thinking is that if 12 people come and you're going to make a law that affects 6.5 million people, I think that is a problem.
Well,
but that's just, I'm not asking to debate it. That's my opinion. The other thing that I really do want to address, and I'm truly not trying to pick on you, but you just have said some things that I think concern me. Let me just say to you that mailing a bill is not a right. Voting is. You cannot compare those two things, because voting is a right given to us by the Constitution. I'm not asking you a question. By the Constitution of the United States. And I can promise you that if my neighbor wanted me to mail their bill, I could, but I can't take their ballot. You cannot compare those two things. Because what I know is there was a time in this nation where being a good neighbor meant something. We helped elderly people. We helped sick people. We helped the people who were disabled. We helped people. Now what we have done is say, I can't help you if you have a problem. That is, and I don't see that harvesting has been a major problem anywhere other than in North Carolina. It's the only place that I'm aware of that it ever has been a problem. So we continue to find solutions for problems that don't exist. So with that, I'm going to ask my questions and then close. The question I ask you, if you remember, what is the one thing you would have us take away from this hearing, or the one thing you would have us do when we get back? We will start with you, Ms. Bonnie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe that we need a framework in place to analyze voting laws as to whether or not they have a discriminatory impact on Native American communities. And if that is updating the pre-clearance formula, then that's what I think would benefit Indian country in Arizona.
Thank you. We'll just go right down the line.
I think it's been very clear that our Native American community has suffered as a result of many of the challenges we've talked about, and so I would encourage the subcommittee to continue dialogue to ensure that the Native American community has its unique issues addressed.
I would encourage the committee to continue to promote and push for the signature of the thing that we have with us all the time, our signature, to be the #1 way that we prove who we are when it comes to voting, not just for our Native American community, but also for really young people who don't have a driver's license yet, have not gotten an ID, and we learned that just this last week with National Voter Registration Day.
I would add along the same veins that I think that what we've been talking about today doesn't just impact our Native American partners and community members, but it impacts our African American community members and our Latino community members. And what we need, if anything else, is a coverage formula that still includes Arizona, because what you've heard today is that we have a serious problem here.
There are over 6 million Americans who cannot vote today, walking around our great nation free, who have jobs, who are members of society, who cannot vote because of a felony conviction. We need to place greater pressure on states and to reform their felon disenfranchisement laws and make it a point that every person who walks freely, who's a citizen of this great country, can vote in every election.
Thank you. I hope the takeaway is that there is overwhelming support for the ban of this deceptive practice and to stop meddling in the state of Arizona and support our laws. The ban of prohibiting ballot practicing. They overwhelmingly support that law.
Thank you. I thank you all so much for being here. I would just say that no law is perfect. We know it. We do that every day. Every member up here knows that we pass laws, we make them better when we find out that there's something that needs to be changed. But I would just suggest that when we err, we should err on the side of the citizenry. We should err on the side of the Constitution and ensure, as the Constitution says, that every single person in this country has the unabridged, unfettered right to vote. Is it difficult to do it the right way? Yes. But I think that in recent years, we have made it more difficult by making it more difficult on protected classes of people, the poor, people of color. I think minorities, it has become very, very clear. But I appreciate the fact that all of you are working to try to make the system better. I just hope that we stop being so high and mighty that we realize that everybody is not like we are. Everyone has not had the same benefits we have had. Those who have been incarcerated, we don't take away their citizenship when we put them in prison. So we should treat them like citizens when they come out. And that means that they should have the right to vote like everyone else in this country. I thank you all very, very much. We will take your testimony and do the best we can to let our colleagues know what is happening in the state of Arizona. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Oh, can't do that. I want to thank the staff, both staffs, for the work that they have done. Thank you very much, staff. I want to thank the Capitol Hill Police, who are here to protect us. We thank you all. The members of the committee, the subcommittee on elections, our chair, Zoe Lofgren, in her absence, this college, Phoenix College, for hosting us, and everyone else who has had anything to do with the successful hearing today. Our staff from the House, from the clerk's office, who is transcribing all of this today, the people who are live streaming it, everyone, thank you all so much. This hearing is adjourned.